There's some massive protests underway at the G20 summit. They were expecting these, obviously. About 100,000 protesters expected in this one, the Welcome to Hell protest. As you can see the sign there, a hardcore group, anti-capitalist protesters, an alliance of them, trying to march into the city center area. Now, there is an official ban on rallies in and around the conference center, so about 20,000 police on hand brought in to secure the area. They've got water cannons. They had to use some of those the other night just to get some people out of an area where they weren't allowed to camp overnight. But obviously a very different greeting for President Trump than he had in Poland yesterday when he arrived in Hamburg, Germany today, and for the other members of the G20. As you can see, the police there marching in between in riot gear, obviously, as those protests are getting underway. It didn't look there was a lot of movement from the crowd, but now it looks like the police either are getting sort of lined up in a different area where they want to be, or just trying to maintain the huge masses of people that they have there. And these are groups that have been there before. They say the G20 has failed to solve the issues that threaten our world. No world peace, issues like climate change, which obviously President Trump leaving that Paris Agreement raises again among the world community and on this world stage. One of the group's leaders talked about President Trump representing the ugly face of capitalism, and that his disregard for women's rights and immigrants mobilized even more forces. You can see a Black Lives Matter sign there among the crowds. And now, unclear if that's maybe some of the water cannons that they've had out there and trying to keep these crowds at bay. But obviously there is some police action there within these crowds in Hamburg, Germany. The G20 summit, again, just getting underway. And you are watching protests in Hamburg, Germany, site of the G20 summit this week, where world leaders are convening. It's Germany's second biggest city. Police trying to contain some of the protesters. Obviously, you see a lot of them moving quickly. We heard like shots before. No idea, but assuming that may have been tear gas, as we could see some of the gas around the area. But police were prepared for this. They brought in extra reinforcements, about 20,000 on hand, because they were expecting about 100,000 protesters. You may have seen the zombie protest yesterday where people painted themselves in clay. This one is the Welcome to Hell protest, and it was organized by an alliance of several anti-capitalist, anti-globalization protest groups. Angry because they say the G20 summit and the G20 leaders have failed to solve the issues of the world. President Trump arriving there earlier today got to see some of this as he first came into the city. They've promised massive protests like this, as you see, obviously, a lot of movement of the protesters to different areas. They've already had to sort of contain some of the crowds using water cannons yesterday. Now today's event getting a little bigger. They were relatively calm and nonviolent protests is what they saw yesterday. The city police, though, are skeptical, not believing that it will remain that way. And as you can see now, police clashing, it seems like, with some of the protesters and people trying to get out of that area. As I said, you can hear the shots if you listen.
Leute, passt auf euch auf, was die Polizei hier macht, ist eine reine Eskalation. Zieht euch zurück, sonst riskiert ihr noch mehr Verletzte. Das ist eine Schweinerei, ihr spielt hier mit Menschenleben. Zieht euch zurück, raus aus unserer Demonstration. Wir sind hier zum Demonstrieren und nicht, um hier die Sache zu eskalieren. Die Eskalation geht von der Polizei aus und wir haben keinen Bock drauf. Zieht euch zurück, damit sich das hier beruhigt.
Bewusst. Lasst die Menschen in Ruhe, geht einfach weg. Und liebe Leute auf der Demo, ihr müsst das Ganze vielleicht auch nicht mit Flaschenwürfen aus vermutlich sicheren Positionen weiter eskalieren, denn hier sind überall noch Teilnehmerinnen und Teilnehmer der Demonstration mit den Versuchen beschäftigt, ihre Ausziehen. Dear participants of the demonstration, please.
If you're just joining us, you are looking at protests in Hamburg, Germany. Police trying to contain the crowd there. These are some water cannons that they've been using among the crowd. We've also heard shots believed to be tear gas. More than 100,000 were expected as part of this Welcome to Hell protest going on at the site of the G20 summit. Now, according to some of those with knowledge of various protest groups in Europe, they expected that of this 100,000, about 8,000 would be part of Europe's violent left-wing scene. So they were prepared, obviously, 20,000 police on hand, as you see the police in riot gear really just running off some of those protesters into various areas in this port city. With the G20 summit going on, people there concerned and protesting about anti-globalization, anti-capitalist movement, the Paris Climate Agreement, obviously of major concern for so many out there. And with President Trump now there and his recent removal of the U.S. from that climate agreement has brought out, some are saying, even more protesters than we would have seen otherwise. But again, things just getting underway at the G20 summit, and this is the beginning of it already that you are watching as police try to get a handle of the protesters, outnumbered 5-1 there, if those numbers are accurate, with 100,000 expected as part of this protest.
Wir fordern die Polizei noch einmal auf, die hier zurück, die eskalieren diese Demonstration. Es ist unfassbar, es sind schon viele Verletzte durch den brutalen Übergriff. Ziehen Sie zurück, damit ich die Situation beruhigen kann. Es ist unfassbar, was ich die Polizei gerade heute.
And again, as we are watching these protests at the G20 summit, important to note a lot of the reports out of there that most of these protesters were peaceful, that there was a small group that maybe were not as peaceful, I guess, protesting peacefully, and that's what sort of led to some of the police action taken up. We said there were some shots earlier, may have actually been some smoke bombs that were fired, as well as police try to disperse some of the crowd. Some stun grenades, smoke grenades as well into this large crowd. And as you can even see, just the water cannons that the German police have there, about 20,000 police in the city to try to contain some of these protesters. As we look at these pictures in Hamburg, Germany, of protests going on and police clashing with those protesters there from the Welcome to Hell protest at the site of the G20 summit, we want to welcome in Paul Waldy. He's a European correspondent for the Globe and Mail. Paul, you were there at the site of the protests when it, I think, got less peaceful and more violent, or at least sparked some police activity. What sparked that? What changed?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. I mean, this thing started out as more like almost a festival type of atmosphere. There was a big stage set up, lots of banners, lots of music, lots of fiery speeches and that. But when I was down there initially, it was, pretty quiet. People were sitting around sort of drinking and just kind of enjoying the sunshine. They inflated this gigantic black block thing and these other things and kind of started the march. But I got to tell you, there were hundreds and hundreds of police that were leading the way in this march. And I think somehow that sparked, a little bit of skirmishing, which kind of went from there because the police presence was really overwhelming, and the police were right in front of the marchers, so it was almost inevitable that somebody was going to do something that would provoke a conflict on one side or the other.
And we've seen some water cannons being used. Also, wasn't certain if it was smoke bombs or tear gas. What were police using to sort of move this crowd and keep some of the crowd back?
Well, the police certainly have everything. They certainly have the water cannons there. You can see the trucks all over the place. They have clearly pepper spray on them. They've got tips on their backs and things like that. Typical kinds of things that you see in these situations. But the police presence is bigger than I think. Certainly, it's bigger than I expected, and it's bigger than I've seen in a lot of similar type of demonstrations. And obviously, there's some people in the crowd that wanted to provoke violence, and I guess they succeeded to some extent.
And those that didn't want to provoke violence, those that did want to peacefully protest, what are the main topics there for them with the G20?
Well, I talked to a lot of people who really just came down to the city partly because they have genuine gripes about globalization. They don't think the G20 leaders doing it with real people. And, in Europe, young people, things like that, the unemployment.
Paul, are you still there? I think we actually have bad connection with Paul right now. Paul, can you still hear us?
Yeah.
Oh, there we've got you again. Sorry, we had a bad connection there with you. Some of the things you were saying that protesters are upset about we lost you right away. And we did lose Paul. We apologize for that. But you heard, some of what Paul had to say with so many police around these protesters, even though so many of them seem to want to protest peacefully. Some of the issues of globalization and capitalism, obviously issues like climate change on their mind, but then the small group that perhaps had unpeaceful protests on their mind. You can see the police have dispersed much of the crowd there, but there were 100,000 that were expected for this Welcome to Hell protest, unlike yesterday's zombie march, which seemed to be a more peaceful one than what we are seeing here today.